How many were killed by the A-bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki?
The death toll from the explosion, on August 9, 1945, was about 40,000. But, as in Hiroshima, thousands more died later due to radiation exposure from the atomic bomb. American military strategists believed that the first A-bomb on Hiroshima would force Japan's leaders to surrender. But when they did not, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, an important seaport and commercial city. That catastrophic attack on Japan brought an end to the war. On August 14, Japan signed the surrender agreement on September 2 aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri, in Tokyo Bay.
Which U.S. president held the first press conference?
President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924. Was the first president to routinely assemble the press to answer questions for the public. On March 15, 1913, shortly after his inauguration, he called the first presidential press conference. More than 100 news reporters attended the event. Decades later, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, became known for his frequent use of the televised press conference to directly communicate with Americans.
What areas of the United States did Hernando de Soto explore?
Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto, c. 1500 to 1542, ventured throughout the southeast before he caught fever and died along the banks of the Mississippi River. Having been part of a brutal expedition that crushed the Inca Empire in what is now Peru, in 1536 de Soto returned to Spain a hero. But he sought to go back to the New World and got his wish when King Charles I, 1500 to 1558, appointed him governor of Cuba and authorized him to conquer and colonize the region that is now the southeastern United States. Arriving in Florida in the winter of 1539, de Soto and an army of about 600 men headed north during the following spring and summer. In search of gold and silver, they traveled through present-day Georgia, through North and South Carolina, through the Great Smoky Mountains, and into Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. After defeating the Choctaw leader Tuscaloosa in October 1540 in south-central Alabama, the Spaniards headed north and west into Mississippi. They crossed the Mississippi River on May 21, 1540, and de Soto died later that same day. Since he had shown no mercy in his conquests of the native peoples, de Soto's troops sunk his body in the river so that it would not be discovered and desecrated by the Indians. Then his army continued on without him. Under the direction of Luis de Moscoso they reached Mexico in 1541.
What were the international contributions to the War on Terror?
According to the U.S. Central Command, by early 2005 there were 70 nations supporting the global war on terror. And 21 nations had deployed more than 16,000 troops to the U.S.-led operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Coalition forces contributed in a variety of ways, including providing intelligence, personnel, security assistance, equipment, and other assets for use in ground, air, and sea operations. Coalition members also provided humanitarian aid to civilians.
Who were the great Islamic philosophers of the Middle Ages?
Three thinkers of the Islamic world stand out as important interpreters of Greek thought, and therefore, as a bridge between ancient philosophy and the scholasticism of the Middle Ages. Their Latin names are Avicenna, Averroes, and Avicenna. Avicenna, c. 878 to 950, who studied with Christian Aristotelians in Baghdad. Iraq, proved so adept at applying the teachings of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. To Muslim thought that he became known as the second Aristotle or the second teacher. He posited that philosophy and religion are not in conflict with each other. Rather, they parallel one another. Also known for his work in interpreting the great Aristotle for the Muslim world. Avicenna, 980-1037, is sometimes referred to as the third teacher. He was also the first to expand the distinction between essence and existence. Averroes, 1126 to 1198, also was no stranger to Aristotle, writing commentaries on him as well as Plato. Specifically, the Republic, he also wrote on religious law and philosophy as well as religion and logic.
Who coined the term Iron Curtain?
It was former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965. In a March 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, he remarked that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The statesman, who had been instrumental in coordinating the Allied victory in World War II, 1939-45, was commenting on Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's, 1879-1953, tactics in Eastern Europe, which indicated the Soviets were putting up barriers against the West and building up Soviet domination behind those barriers. Just as he had issued warnings of the threat posed by Nazi Germany prior to World War II. Churchill astutely observed the rapidly emerging situation in Eastern Europe. In 1946 the Soviets installed communist governments in neighboring Romania and in nearby Bulgaria. In 1947 Hungary and Poland came under communist control as well. And the following year, communists took control of Czechoslovakia. These countries, along with Albania, Yugoslavia, and East Germany, soon formed a coalition of communist allies and the Eastern Bloc was formed. The United States and its democratic allies formed the Western Bloc. The stage was set for the Cold War, 1947–89.
Who invented jazz?
Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, 1885–1941, a New Orleans pianist, claimed credit for having invented jazz. And to some degree, it was fair of him to think so after all, his recordings with the group the Red Hot Peppers. 1926–30, are among the earliest examples of disciplined jazz ensemble work. But in truth, the evolution of jazz from ragtime and blues was something that many musicians in several cities took part in. Most regard Morton as one of the founders of jazz, the other founders include Benny Moten. 1894–1935, U.B. Blake, 1883–1983, Duke Ellington, 1899–1974, and Thomas Fats Waller, 1904–1943. Some would go back even farther to trace the roots of jazz, from 1899 to 1914 Scott Joplin. 1868 to 1917, popularized ragtime, which was based on African folk music. Even astute music critics may not be able to draw a clear-cut distinction between ragtime and early jazz. Both musical forms rely on syncopation, the stressing of the weak beats. And either style can be applied to an existing melody and transform it. The definitions and boundaries of the two terms have always been subject to debate, which is further complicated by the fact that some musicians of the time considered ragtime to be more or less a synonym for early jazz. But there are important, albeit not strict, differences between the two genres as well. Rags were composed and written down in the European style of notation, while early jazz was learned by ear. Players would simply show one another how a song went by playing it. Jazz encourages and expects improvisation, whereas ragtime, for the most part, did not. And the basic rhythms are also markedly different, with jazz having a swing or hot rhythm that ragtime does not. Whatever its origins, jazz became part of the musical mainstream by the 1930s and influenced other musical genres as well, including classical. American composer George Gershwin, 1898–1937, was both a songwriter and composer of rags as well as a composer of symphonic works. Many of his works, including Rhapsody in Blue, 1924, and his piano preludes, contain ragtime and jazz elements. Perhaps more than any other composer and musician, Miles Davis, 1926–1991, expanded the genre, through decades of prolific work. Davis constantly pushed the boundaries of what defines jazz and in so doing set standards for other musicians.
Why is Titian thought of as the father of modern painting?
During Titian's time, 1488 or 1490 to 1576, artists began painting on canvas rather than on wood panels. A master of color, the Venetian painter was both popular and prolific. His work was so sought after that even with the help of numerous assistants, he could not keep up with demand. His body of works established oil color on canvas as the typical medium of Western pictorial tradition. Among his most well-known paintings are Sacred and Profane Love, c. 1515, and Venus of Urbino, 1538.
What does Messiah mean?
Messiah is the Hebrew word for anointed one. In the broadest sense, a Messiah is the professed or accepted leader of some hope or cause. Jesus is believed by Christians to be the Messiah whose arrival was foretold by the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah 9:6, it states that a child will be born among the people. A son is given to us, he will bear the symbol of dominion, and his title will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty Hero, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace.
What caused the Vietnam War?
In the simplest terms, the long conflict in Southeast Asia was fought over the unification of Communist North Vietnam and non-Communist South Vietnam. The two countries had been set up in 1954. Prior to that, all of Vietnam was part of the French colony of Indochina. But in 1946, the Vietnamese fought the French for control of their own country. The United States provided financial support to France. But the French were ultimately defeated in 1954. Once France had withdrawn its troops, an international conference was convened in Geneva to decide what should be done with Vietnam. The country was divided into two partitions, along the 17th parallel. This division of land was not intended to be permanent. But the elections that were supposed to reunite the partitions were never held. Vietnamese President Ho Chi Minh, 1892 to 1969, took power in the north while Emperor Bao Dai, 1913 to 1997, for a while, ruled the south. But the communist government in the north opposed the non-communist government of South Vietnam and believed the country should still be united. The North Vietnamese supported anti-government groups in the south and over time stepped up aid to those groups. These communist-trained South Vietnamese were known as the Viet Cong. Between 1957 and 1965, the Viet Cong struggled against the South Vietnamese government. But in the mid-1960s, North Vietnam initiated a large-scale troop infiltration into South Vietnam, and the fighting became a full-fledged war. China and the Soviet Union provided the North Vietnamese with military equipment, but not manpower. The United States provided both equipment and troops to non-communist South Vietnam in its struggle against the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. By 1969 there were more than 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam. This policy was controversial back in America, where protests to involvement in the Vietnam War continued until the last U.S. troops were brought home in 1973. In January of that year, the two sides had agreed to a ceasefire, but the fighting broke out again after the American ground troops left. On April 30, 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to North Vietnam and the war, which had lasted nearly 2 decades, ended. North Vietnam unified the countries as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. For its part, the North Vietnamese called the conflict a war of national liberation. They viewed the long struggle as an extension of the earlier struggle with France. They also perceived the war to be another attempt by a foreign power, this time the United States, to rule Vietnam.
What was the Act of Settlement?
The 1701 decree reiterated the Bill of Rights of 1689 by stating that the King or Queen of England must not be a Roman Catholic and must also not be married to a Roman Catholic. The Act of Settlement further stipulated that the sovereign must be a member of the Protestant Church of England. The measure was passed by Parliament, in part due to fear of the Jacobites. Supporters of the Stuart King, James II, 1633–1701, who had been exiled in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution. The Jacobites, not to be confused with the French Jacobins, the political party that came to power during the French Revolution, sought to keep the House of Stuart in power. Due to the line of succession, however, the Act of Settlement did not take effect until 1714, when Queen Anne (1665–1714) died and left no successors to the throne. She was the last Stuart ruler of England.
Is blues music older than jazz?
Only slightly, and only if your definition of jazz doesn't include ragtime. Really, the two musical traditions developed side by side, with blues emerging about the first decade of the 1900s and hitting the height of its early popularity in 1920s Harlem, where the songs were seen as an expression of African American life. Great blues singers like Ma Rainey, 1886–1939, and Bessie Smith, 1894 or 1898–1937, sang of the black reality determined but weary. During the Harlem Renaissance the music was a symbol for African American people who were struggling to be accepted for who they were. Poet Langston Hughes, 1902–1967, saw the blues as a distinctly black musical genre. and as helping to free blacks from American standardization. As the first person to codify and publish blues songs. American musician and composer W. C. Handy, 1873 to 1958, is considered the father of the blues. The Florence, Alabama, native produced a number of well-known works, including Memphis Blues, St. Louis Blues, which is one of the most frequently recorded songs in popular music, Bale Street Blues, and Careless Love.
How old is the dramatic form of tragedy?
Tragedy, a form of drama central to Western literature, dates to ancient times, the 5th century B.C., when Greeks held a religious festival to honor the god Dionysus, god of fertility, wine, and, later, drama. Famous ancient tragedies include Oresteia by Aeschylus, who is credited with inventing tragedy, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, and Medea and Trojan Women by Euripides. The philosopher Aristotle observed that tragedy's function is a cathartic one by participating in the drama. The spectators are purged of their emotions of pity and fear. The well-known Renaissance tragedies of William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, harken back to the works of Roman statesman and playwright Seneca, c4b.ca.d65, who wrote during the 1st century. He is credited with creating dramatic conventions including unity of time and place, violence, bombastic language, revenge, and ghostly appearances.
Who were the Normans?
The Normans, like the Danes, originated in Scandinavia and were Vikings. In the mid-800s they invaded northern France, ousting the Franks who had conquered the region 400 years earlier. There they stayed, in the region that came to be known as Normandy, or Normandy. In 1066 the Norman Duke William, the Conqueror, 1027 to 1087, sailed across the Channel and claimed the English throne, uniting Normandy with the English kingdom. This arrangement lasted until 1204 when French King Philip Augustus, 1165 to 1223, reclaimed the territory. England took it back during the 15th century. But in 1450 Normandy was permanently restored to France, becoming a province. Norman descendants still live there today, and their influence is also evident across the English Channel, where the Norman nobility intermixed with the Anglo-Saxons.
What were the killing fields?
After communist leader Pol Pot, 1928 to 1998, head of the Khmer Rouge, took over the Cambodian government in 1975, he ordered a collectivization drive, rounding up anyone who was believed to have been in collusion with or otherwise supported the former regime of Lon Nol, 1913 to 1985. The government instituted executions, forced labor, in so-called re-education camps, and famine combined to kill 1 in every 5 Cambodians, or an estimated 2 million people, during Pol Pot's reign. He was removed from power in the Vietnamese invasion of 1978 to 1979, and he died in hiding. In 1998. On December 29 of that year, 2 former Khmer Rouge leaders surrendered to authorities. Q Sam Phan, age 67, and Nguyen Chia, 71. The two appeared in a televised news conference. Asked if he was sorry for the suffering that claimed the lives of millions of Cambodians, Q Sam Phan looked straight at the questioner and answered in English, "Yes, sorry, very sorry." Nguyen Chia said, "We are very sorry. Not just for the human lives but also animal lives that were lost in the war." However, neither Sam Phan nor Chia accepted personal responsibility for the killing fields. While Sam Phan pled not to be tried for his crimes and Prime Minister Hun Sen, 1950, of Cambodia seemed inclined toward closing the book on this dark chapter in the country's history. There was public outcry to bring the former Khmer leaders to justice. Supporters of a trial assert that Cambodia will have no peace until someone is punished for the killing fields for the Khmer's genocidal regime.
Is Thomas Edison the greatest inventor in history?
Some believe that he is, and for good reason, Thomas Alva Edison, 1847 to 1931. The so-called Wizard of Menlo Park, registered 1,300 patents in his name during his lifetime. More than have been credited to any other individual in American history. His best-known inventions include an automatic telegraphy machine, a stock ticker machine, the phonograph. 1877, the incandescent light bulb, 1878, and the motion picture machine, kinetoscope, 1891. Edison also made one major scientific find during his research, when he observed that electrons are emitted from a heated cathode. The conductor in an electron tube, the phenomenon is known as the Edison effect. When Edison was still in his 20s, he set up a laboratory where 50 consulting engineers worked with him on various inventions. By his own description, the Newark, New Jersey, plant was an invention factory. It operated for 6 years, during which Edison was granted about 200 new patents for work completed there. The laboratory is regarded by most as the first formally organized non-academic research center in the United States. By 1876 Edison had outgrown his Newark facilities and arranged for the construction of a new plant at Menlo Park, New Jersey. His most productive work was accomplished at this location over the next decade.
Who was Balanchine?
The The name of the Russian-born choreographer is synonymous with modern American ballet. George Balanchine, 1904 to 1983, was one of the most influential choreographers of the 20th century. Creating more than 200 ballets in his lifetime and choreographing 19 Broadway musicals as well as 4 Hollywood films. He co-founded 3 of the country's foremost dance institutions. The School of American Ballet, in 1934, the American Ballet Company, 1935. And the New York City Ballet, 1948, the first American ballet company to become a public institution. His entrance into the world of dance was entirely accidental. In August 1914, Balanchine accompanied his sister to an audition at the Imperial School of Ballet and was invited to audition as well. Though his sister failed, he passed and, against his own wishes, was promptly enrolled. However, Balanchine remained uninterested in the art form, even running away from school shortly after starting. The turning point for the young dancer came with a performance of Tchaikovsky's ballet The Sleeping Beauty, 1890. He was dazzled by the experience and chose to stay with the school's rigorous training program. Serenade, 1935, music by Tchaikovsky, is considered by many to be Balanchine's signature work. His other well-known works include Apollo, 1928, The Prodigal Son, 1929, The Nutcracker, 1954, and Don Quixote, 1965, as well as Jewels, the first full-length ballet without a plot. Remembering the opportunity he had been given as a child, Balanchine was known for choreographing children's roles into many of his ballets. His outreach did not end there. He organized lecture demonstration tours for schools, gave free ballet performances for underprivileged children, conducted free annual seminars for dance teachers, and gave free advice and use of his ballets to other ballet companies. Balanchine's unparalleled body of work was instrumental in establishing the vibrant style and content of contemporary ballet in America, where he brought ballet to the forefront of the performing arts.
Why was Bunker Hill important in the American Revolution?
The June 1775 battle on the hills outside Boston proved to be the bloodiest battle of the war. After the fighting in April at Lexington and Concord, more British troops arrived in Boston in late May. The Americans fortified Breed's Hill, near Bunker Hill. And on June 17, the British were ordered to attack the Americans there. The Patriots, who needed to conserve ammunition, were given the famous direction not to fire until they saw the whites of their enemies' eyes. The Patriots succeeded in driving the British back on their first 2 charges. But on the 3rd charge, the Patriots fled. The Battle of Bunker Hill resulted in more than 1,000 injured or dead British soldiers and 400 American soldiers killed or wounded.
Who was Typhoid Mary?
Typhoid Mary was the name given to Mary Mallon, c. 1870 to 1938, the first known carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. Though Mallon had recovered from the disease, as a cook in New York City area restaurants she continued to spread typhoid fever germs to others, infecting more than 50 people between 1900 and 1915. The New York State Sanitation Department connected her to at least 6 typhoid fever outbreaks there. Officials finally and permanently institutionalized her in 1914 to prevent further spread of the acute infectious disease.
Will Mother Teresa be sainted?
As of the early 2000s, Mother Teresa of Calcutta was on the road to sainthood. On October 19, 2003, she was beatified. A key step in the process that began just 2 years after her death. Her worldwide reputation of holiness prompted Pope John Paul II, 1920 to 2005. To waive the customary 5-year waiting period for the cause of canonization to begin. Mother Teresa's heroic virtues, a requirement for sainthood, were well known long before she died. The modern martyr spent nearly 70 years working as a missionary among the poor. The last 50 of them in outreach to society's most downtrodden, the impoverished, sick and dying. She lived modestly, dressed simply, usually in a plain white sari, which she felt identified her with the poor, and devoted herself wholly to helping those society had forgotten. The so-called Saint of the Gutter received worldwide recognition for her work. In 1979 she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Though she came into contact with some of the world's most influential people, she was unchanged by the attention. When the Pope gave her a Lincoln Continental for her own personal transportation, she auctioned it off to raise needed funds for her works of charity. Reportedly, when she visited Britain's Princess Diana, 1961 to 1997, the nun looked on the large rooms in the royal palace and uttered something to the effect of, "Just think how many people could live in these rooms." Another requirement of sainthood is involvement in miracles. In October 2002 it was reported that Pope John Paul's office had attributed a miracle to Mother Teresa. A young Indian woman was cured of a stomach tumor after praying to her. The Vatican, however, found no scientific explanation for the woman's recovery. On December 20, 2002, the Pope approved the decrees of her heroic virtues and miracles, paving the way for Mother Teresa's beatification in 2003. Her sainthood appeared to be imminent.
Why are Kant's philosophies still relevant?
Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, remains one of the great modern thinkers because he developed a whole new philosophy. one that completely reinterpreted human knowledge. A professor at Germany's Königsberg University beginning in 1755. Kant lectured widely and was a prolific writer. His most important work came somewhat late in life after 1775.
Was the Civil War fought because of slavery?
For years, American school children learned that the question of slavery was the only cause of the Civil War. 1861 to 65 with 19 free states and 15 slave states making up the Union, Abraham Lincoln. 1809 to 1865, had called the country a house divided even before he became president. While slavery was central to the conflict, many believe the bloody four-year war had other causes as well. By the mid-1800s, important differences had developed between the South and the North, and many maintain these differences, or vestiges of them, are still with the country today. The economy in the South was based on agriculture while the North was industrialized. The ideals and lifestyles of each region reflected these economic realities. Southerners believed their agrarian lifestyle was dependent on the labor of slaves. For a long time, slavery was viewed by some as a necessary evil. But by the early 1800s, the view that slavery is morally wrong was beginning to take hold. Northern abolitionists had begun a movement to end slavery in the states. But, except for a small anti-slavery faction, these views were not shared in the South. There were other factors that contributed to the declaration of secession and the formation of the Confederacy. Although some still argue these factors were merely smokescreens for the defense of slavery. Disputes between the federal government and the states had limited the power of the states, and this policy was called into question by Southerners. Further, the political party system was in disarray in mid-1850s America. The disorder prompted feelings of distrust for the elected politicians who set national policy. Before the 1860 presidential election, Southern leaders urged that the South secede from the Union if Lincoln, who had publicly taken a stand against slavery, won.
What were indentured servants?
During colonial times in America, there were two kinds of indentured servants, voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary servants were people, often trained in a craft or skill, who could not afford passage to the colonies. In exchange for their passage, they agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years for a colonial master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. Involuntary indentured servants were criminals whose sentence was a period of servitude. The impoverished, or those in debt. Most indentured servants were involuntary. their period of obligation to a colonial master was longer than that of a voluntary servant, usually 7 to 14 years. But, like their counterparts, the involuntary servants also received land, tools, or money at the end of their contract, and they, too, became freemen. The arrival of indentured servants in the American colonies addressed a labor shortage that emerged in the early 1600s. In 1618 the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that encouraged the development of Virginia, adopted a new charter based on the head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies were also developed under the head right system, with the land amounts varying by colony. Soon there were more farms than there was labor to work the fields. The colonists solved this problem through the system of indentured servitude. Many indentured servants were drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. In European ports, people contracted themselves or became involuntarily contracted to ship captains, who transported them to the colonies, where their contracts were sold to the highest bidder. Roughly half the colonial immigrants were indentured servants. Colonial laws ensured servants would fulfill the term of their obligation. Any servant who ran away was severely punished. Laws also protected the servants, whose masters were obligated to provide them with housing, food, medical care, and even religious training. The system was prevalent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, but it was also used in the South. When the economies of the Caribbean islands failed at the end of the 1600s, plantation owners sold their slaves to the mainland, where they worked primarily on southern plantations, replacing indentured servants by about 1700. In other colonies, the system ended with the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
What were the Hussite Wars?
The Hussite Wars were fought in the former Kingdom of Bohemia, part of present-day Czech Republic. Between 1420 and 1433, the country was plunged into the 13-Year War by festering hostilities between papal forces and Bohemian peasants. The Hussites, named such since they were followers of religious reformer Jan Hus, c. 1373 to 1415, in the Four Articles of Prague, 1420, the Hussites called for freedom of preaching, limits to church property holding, and civil punishment of mortal sin. The fighting ended in 1433 with the Compromise of the Council of Basel and 3 years later was officially ended by the Compact of Vigo, 1436. In which a faction of the Hussites agreed to accept the Holy Roman Emperor as king. The peasants had succeeded nevertheless in asserting Bohemian nationalism and had severed the country's ties to Germany.
What was the Berlin airlift?
It was the response during 1948 and 1949 to the Soviet blockade of West Berlin. After World War II, 1939–45, the German city had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. But following the conclusion of the war, it did not take long for the Cold War. 1947–89, between the Western powers and the Soviet Union to heat up. When the Americans, British, and French agreed to combine their 3 areas of Berlin into one economic entity. The Soviets responded by cutting the area off from all supply routes. In June 1948, all arteries, road, rail, and water into West Berlin were blocked by Soviet troops. Since Berlin was completely surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone, the Soviets clearly believed the blockade would be an effective move that would prompt the Western countries to pull out. But the move failed. The Americans, British, and French set up a massive airlift. For the next 11 months, West Berlin was supplied with food and fuel entirely by airplanes. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949, and the airlift ended by September.
How many countries were part of the Axis powers?
The Axis, which was forged in 1936, included an alliance of 3 nations: Germany, Italy, and Japan. These major powers were joined by 6 smaller countries. The Axis satellites: Albania, Bulgaria, Finland, Hungary, Romania, and Thailand. But together these countries never comprised the unified front and strength that the Allied powers did. Germany started the war on September 1, 1939, and was joined in June 1940 by Italy and Albania. In the middle of 1941, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Finland joined the Axis effort. Japan, which was already fighting with China, in the Sino-Japanese War, entered the fray on December 7, 1941, with its attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii. Thailand was the last Axis country to enter the war, on January 25, 1942.
What were carpetbaggers?
Carpetbaggers was a derisive term that referred to Northerners who arrived in the South in the early days of Reconstruction. 1865–77, the 12-year period of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861–65. Even though many of these Northern businessmen intended to settle in the South, Southerners viewed them as outsiders and, worse, as opportunists who only intended to make a quick profit before returning north. They were called carpetbaggers because many carried carpetbags as luggage. Some Southerners even quipped that these Northerners could carry all their belongings in a carpetbag, implying that they were nothing more than transients. Nevertheless, Northerners who relocated to the South following The Civil War played an important role during Reconstruction. Some, aided by the black vote, gained public office and impacted state and local policy. But others proved to be corrupt. Because of the latter, the term carpetbagger became synonymous with a meddling, opportunistic outsider.
Who determines whether a law violates the liberties guaranteed by the Bill of Rights?
It is the job of the U.S. Supreme Court to decide whether or not a law impinges upon the liberties listed in or implied by the Bill of Rights, 1791. The difficult task before the Supreme Court justices is in determining what rights are implied. Such questions prompt months of hearings and deliberations before a decision can be reached as to the constitutionality of a contested law. The judicial body makes its determinations based on a majority vote of the 9 justices, 1 Chief Justice and 8 associates. Established as the highest court in the country by Article 3 of the Constitution, the court has ultimate authority in all legal questions that arise pertaining to the Constitution. Called the Court of Last Resorts, the Supreme Court both interprets the acts of Congress, including laws and treaties, and determines the constitutionality of federal and state laws, under the 14th Amendment. The court has upheld that most of the Bill of Rights also applies to state governments.
How was the Byzantine Empire formed?
The Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire. Its citizens even called themselves Romans. 2 dates are given for the formation of the Byzantine Empire, which, though boundaries shifted constantly, was centered in Asia Minor and the Balkan Peninsula, in AD 395, upon the death of Emperor Theodosius the Great. The Roman Empire was divided into 2, East and West. In the years that followed, the West Roman Empire was subject to repeated attacks from nomadic barbarian groups, and Rome finally fell in 476. The East Roman Empire survived as the Byzantine Empire, which, after the fall of Rome, laid claim to much of the lands in the West. However, many historians date the beginning of the Byzantine Empire earlier at AD 330, when Roman Emperor Constantine the Great moved the capital of the then united Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantium, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, subsequently known as Constantinople. By this definition of the empire, Constantine the Great was its first ruler. He was succeeded by nearly 100 rulers over the course of more than 1,000 years of Byzantine rule. At its height, during the 6th century reign of Justinian I from 483 to 565, the empire included parts of southern and eastern Europe, northern Africa, and the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire ended when the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453.
What is muckraking journalism?
Muckrakers are journalists who seek out and expose the misconduct of prominent people or of high-profile organizations. They emerged on the American scene in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Crusaders for social change, muckraking journalists wrote articles not about news events, but about injustices or abuses, bringing them to the attention of the American public. Published in newspapers and magazines, the articles exposed corruption in business and politics. While the early muckrakers were sometimes criticized for their tactics, their work succeeded in raising widespread awareness of social, economic, and political ills, prompting a number of reforms, including passage of pure food laws and antitrust legislation. American politician Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, dubbed the controversial journalists muckrakers, a reference to a character in Pilgrim's Progress. By English preacher John Bunyan 1628 to 1688, who rejects a crown for a muckrake, a tool used to rake dung.
Why was Socrates condemned to death?
Socrates, c. 470 to 399 BC, the Greek philosopher who is credited, along with philosophers Plato, c. 428 to 347 BC. And Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, for laying the foundations of Western thought, had many followers in his own time. However, his ideas and methods were controversial, too, which led him to be tried before judges and sentenced to death, which he carried out by drinking hemlock, poison. He had been charged for not worshipping the Athenian gods and for corrupting the young.
How old is the AFL-CIO?
The roots of the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations. AFL-CIO, today a federation of national unions. Date to 1881 when the Federation of Organized Trade and Labor Unions was formed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, by trade union leaders representing some 50,000 members in the United States and Canada. Reorganizing in 1886, the Association of Unions changed its name to the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and elected Samuel Gompers, 1850 to 1924, president. Unlike the open membership policy of the Knights of Labor, from whom the AFL gained numerous members in 1886, the AFL determined to organize by craft. At the outset, its member unions included a total of 140,000 skilled laborers. Gompers, who immigrated from England in 1863 and became the first registered member of the Cigar Makers International Union in 1864, had been active in labor for more than 2 decades. Once chosen as president of the AFL, Gompers remained in that office, with the exception of only 1 year. until his death in 1924. During the nearly 40-year period, he shaped the Labor Federation and helped it make strides by determining a general policy that allowed member unions autonomy. Unlike the Knights of Labor, which pursued long-term goals such as Knights leader Terence Powderly's abstract objective of making every man his own master, every man his own employer, the AFL focused its efforts on specific, short-term goals such as higher wages, shorter hours, and the right to bargain collectively, when an employer agrees to negotiate with workers/union representatives. In the 1890s, the AFL was weakened by labor violence, which evoked public fears. A July 1892 strike at the Carnegie Steel Plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, turned into a riot between angry steel workers and Pinkerton guards. The militia was called in to monitor the strike, which 5 months later ended in failure for the AFL-affiliated steel workers. Nevertheless, under Gompers's leadership, membership of the AFL grew to more than 1 million by 1901 and to 2.5 million by 1917, when it included 111 national unions and 27,000 local unions. The Federation collected dues from its members, creating a fund to aid striking workers. The organization avoided party politics, instead seeking out and supporting advocates regardless of political affiliation. The AFL worked to support the establishment of the U.S. Department of Labor, 1913, which administers and enforces statutes promoting the welfare and advancement of the American workforce, and the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, eventually delivering a blow to monopolies. The CIO was founded in 1938. In the early 1930s, several AFL unions banded together as the Committee for Industrial Organization and successfully conducted campaigns to sign up new members in mass production facilities such as the automobile, steel, and rubber industries. Since these initiatives, which resulted in millions of new members, were against the AFL policy of signing up only skilled laborers by craft, the CIO had reached out to all industrial workers. Regardless of skill level or craft, a schism resulted within the AFL. The unions that had participated in the CIO membership drive were expelled from the AFL. The CIO established itself as a federation in 1938, officially changing its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. In 1955, amidst a climate of increasing anti-unionism, the AFL and CIO rejoined to form one strong voice. Today the organization has craft and industrial affiliates at the international, national, state, and local levels, with membership totaling in the millions.
What was the Red Terror?
The Red Terror was the brutal coercion used by the Communists during the tumultuous years of civil unrest that followed the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks, now called Communists, put their leader, Vladimir Lenin, 1870 to 1924, into power. Delivering on the Bolshevik promise to end the country's involvement in World War I, 1914 to 18. Lenin immediately called for peace talks with Germany, ending the fighting on the Eastern Front. Germany and the other Central Powers would be prevented from victory on the Western Front by the entry of the United States into the war that same year. But the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, signed March 3, 1918, dictated harsh and many believed humiliating terms to Russia, which was forced to give up vast territories including Finland, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldavia, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Meantime, Russians had elected officials to a parliamentary assembly. But when the results were unfavorable to Lenin, of the 703 deputies chosen, only 168 were communists. He ordered his troops to bar the deputies from convening, and so the assembly was permanently disbanded. In its place, Lenin established a dictatorship based on communist secret police, the Cheka. Further, the radical social reforms he had promised took the form of government takeover of Russia's industries and the seizure of farm products from the peasants. Lenin's hard-handed tactics created opposition to the communists, colloquially known as the Reds. The opposition organized their White Army, and civil war ensued. In September 1918, Lenin was nearly assassinated by a political opponent, prompting Lenin's supporters to organize the retaliative initiative that came to be known as the Red Terror. Though thousands of communist opponents were killed as a result, the unrest in Russia would not end until 1920. And some believe the ruthless repression of the Red Terror lasted into 1924.
What were wildcat banks?
Wildcat banks were state-chartered financial institutions that operated in the United States from the early 1800s until the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. They were known as wildcat banks for their free lending policies and their issue of paper currency that could not be backed up by gold or silver, called specie. The Second National Bank of the United States operated between 1816 and 1836, during which time the federally controlled bank was able to restrain the wildcat institutions, which predominated in the West and South, requiring them to issue only what currency they could convert to coin. But when the charter of the Second National Bank of the United States was allowed to expire in 1836, the wildcat banks resumed their unsound banking practices. Paper currency issue and lending went unregulated amidst a rush to buy lands on the frontier. The nation's currency wildly fluctuated as the renegade financial institutions loosened and tightened the money supply to suit their own needs. Further, since there were so many banks issuing their own notes, another problem introduced itself: counterfeiting. No one could tell what was true bank currency and what was the product of a good counterfeiter. With inflation rampant and land speculation at a new high, on July 11, 1836, President Andrew Jackson, 1767–1845, intent on reigning in the wildcat banks, issued the Specie Circular. An order that government agents accept nothing but gold or silver as payment for new lands. When prospective land buyers, particularly in the West, took their paper bills to the state-chartered banks to be converted to coin, they found the banks' tills were empty, and the holders were therefore denied the face value of their notes. Bank after bank closed its doors, causing a financial panic in 1837. But many state banks remained in business, and the issue of regulating paper currency continued to trouble the nation.
What are the hallmarks of classical Greek civilization?
Among the great Greek philosophers are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Greek literature includes the epic poetry of Homer as well as the passionate love poems of Sappho. The Greeks gave humankind the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, which continue to be studied by students today, along with the comedies of Aristophanes and Menander. The classical Greeks loved to speak, and oratory is considered by some to be their highest form of prose. Orators known to the modern world are Antiphon, Lysias, Isocrates, and Demosthenes. Herodotus, called the father of history, left the modern world with an account of the Persian Wars. 500 to 449 BC, a conflict between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. The Greeks also gave humankind the father of medicine in physician Hippocrates, who taught that doctors should use reason to determine the cause of illness and should study the patient's appearance, behavior, and lifestyle to diagnose and treat. The Hippocratic Oath, versions of which are still sworn by medical students graduating today, is attributed to Hippocrates. Greek scientists include Thales and Pythagoras, scientist philosophers include Leucippus and Democritus. And of course, the Greeks gave modern culture the Olympic Games.
What was the impact of the disaster at Chernobyl?
As the worst nuclear power plant disaster to date, the Chernobyl accident in 1986 had far-reaching effects. Total fallout from the accident eventually reached a level 10 times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Japan, on August 6, 1945, at the end of World War II, 1939–45. Some 30 firefighters and plant workers died just after the accident. Plants and animals in the immediate area and downwind of the plant were heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. More than 10 years after the accident, food crops still could not be planted in the region. The immediate after-effects were felt in Europe as well. Some Italian vegetables were found to be contaminated. Reindeer meat in Lapland, a region above the Arctic Circle and extending over northern Norway. Sweden, Finland, and Russia, was declared unfit for human consumption, also due to radioactive contamination. And for a time, fresh meat from Eastern Europe was banned by the EC, European Community. After the accident, some experts predicted disastrous long-term effects, estimating that between 6,500 and 45,000 people could die as a result of cancer caused by exposure to radiation. But a report issued by the World Health Organization, WHO, in 2000 concluded that there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to radiation exposure 14 years after the accident. There is no scientific evidence of increases in overall cancer incidence or mortality or in non-malignant disorders that could be related to radiation exposure. Since the type of nuclear power plant, called RMBK, in use in the former Soviet Union is no longer in operation elsewhere in the world, non-Soviet scientists had few lessons to learn from the event. One American nuclear expert remarked that most of the lessons from Chernobyl have been learned already and applied in the United States. However, opinion remained divided over the relative safety of nuclear power in general.